Adolf Hitler never existed, Ronald Reagan would most likely take his place as the 20th century's most despicably evil person. This video does not necessarily exclude all the good he has done either, it just so happens that he has never done anything good in his entire fucking life. Now it was the 1980s, people were dancing, neons were flashing, and some really good music was made. American media was booming, so you wouldn't exactly assume that this time was tied with US imperialism, labor union busting, and the catalyst for the most extreme wealth inequality we see in the United States today. Now, before his presidency, during the 1950s, Reagan was a C-list actor, eventually becoming the president of a Screen Actors Guild, which is an actors' labor union. But this was the McCarthy era, so being a communist was heavily persecuted in the US, and while Reagan was the president of a labor union, he was also supplying the FBI with names of suspected communists. As we can see, his shittiness started all the way back then. But his big break into politics was in the 1960s, when he narrated a propaganda documentary titled The Truth About Communism, which is a hilarious watch if you know even a little bit about history or communist ideology. He also made a film where he openly opposed social security and health insurance for senior citizens, complaining about the interventionist state providing public services. Ah yes, those damn communist politicians creating public health services. Now these films served as a clear transition Reagan would make into his future political career, using his showmanship and being against anything remotely leftist, communal, or egalitarian, running with it to the fullest and eventually becoming the governor of California in 1966. Now he already showed his true colors as a right-wing police-loving pig when he openly supported the cracking down on anti-Vietnam War protests before being a governor. During his time as governor, however, he used his power to call in the National Guard on the protest at People's Park, an event which later became known as Bloody Thursday, where the police reportedly acted like fighting the Viet Cong, and even one student got killed. When confronted with his brutal handling of the protest, Reagan openly stated, "If it takes a bloodbath, let's get it over with. No more appeasement." Now, apart from being pro-Vietnam War, which is already quite, Reagan was already very fucking racist. Like Jim Crow South type of racist. More will be said in his presidency arc, but as governor, the first thing he wanted to repeal was a California law called the Rumford Act, which prohibited racial discrimination on housing from landlords. He stated, and I quote, "If an individual wants to discriminate against Negroes or others in selling or renting their house, he has the right to do so." His racism also made him sign the Mulford Act, a law which to this day prohibits openly carrying weapons in California.
Because a school shooting happened, right?
No, because the Black Panthers were protesting with guns out to intimidate racist police officers. He also openly opposed the Civil and Voting Rights Act during the Civil Rights Movement, which eventually ended Jim Crow, on the grounds of freedom. And to top it all off, like a cherry on top, in a private conversation with another fellow human degenerate, Richard Nixon, he described African delegates in the United Nations as
those monkeys from those African countries. Damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes.
Yeah. And to set a trend for what's to come with his economic policy, still as a governor he cut the state budget for public universities by about 20%, which ultimately collapsed public funding in general in that state. This ultimately made the universities reliant on tuition and private funding and made them less accessible and more expensive. So when you're complaining about having to take a life-binding loan to pay for your university in the United States, blame Ronald Reagan. And that was before he became the President of the United States. Now it's the year 1981 and Ronald Reagan just became the President of the United States. His foreign policy, or the Reagan Doctrine, can be summed up as the following. Doesn't matter if we support little Satan, as long as it secures our global capitalist hegemony over the planet, we'll take it. Now the most famous example of this was the Iran-Contra affair, which happened at the end of Reagan's presidency, so he basically dodged all legal responsibility. It involved the illegal sale of weapons to Iran in turn for hostages held by Hezbollah. The profits from these sales were then illegally diverted to support the Contra rebels in Nicaragua, which were rebels who were fighting the socialist Sandinista government. Now as I said, the thing about this operation was that it was super fucking illegal.
Was all this legal? Absolutely fucking not.
Not only did Reagan bypass Congress, checks and balances on executive power, to illegally sell the weapons, but then he used the profits from these sales to fund the Contras, which was in direct violation of the Boland Amendment, which prohibited further aid to the Contras. Now the Contras, short for Contra-Revolución, were a right-wing paramilitary organization who supported the ex-Nicaraguan Somoza dictatorship, a dictatorship which the US totally coincidentally really liked. The Sandinistas won a popular socialist revolution against the dictatorship, which of course the CIA and Reagan did not like. The Reagan administration could not legally support the Contras, but with a little help of the CIA, he did so anyway. providing them with financial resources, weapons funneling, military training, and logistical support. But so what? The Contras were just freedom-loving rebels against those damn commies, right? Of course not. The Contras were responsible for numerous attacks on villages and communities suspected of supporting the Sandinistas. These attacks resulted in the deaths of civilians, many of them specifically targeted as teachers and healthcare workers. And to top it all off, because you know that I saved the best for last, the Contras got most of their funding by producing cocaine and selling it back to the United States, while the CIA was fully aware of it. In 1996, investigative journalist Gary Webb published a series of articles titled Dark Alliance, where Webb alleged that the CIA was fully complicit in the drug trafficking done by the Contras. This later circles back to the crack epidemic that Reagan was again complicit in.
I was getting my coke from a guy by the name of Oscar Danilo Blandon, who also was my informant. He's a guy that set me up with the police. When I went to trial, we found out that he was what they call a Contra. The Contras was backed by the CIA.
Of course, Iran-Contra was not just an isolated fuck-up. The Reagan administration was defined as a series of fuck-ups. Almost like those weren't really fuck-ups, but deliberate policies in the name of anti-communism and integral to the Reagan doctrine. The Reagan administration supported the Guatemalan military dictatorship, providing them with equipment, training, and intelligence support aimed at combating leftist guerrilla insurgencies. This all while the US fully knew about the Guatemalan severe human rights violations for decades. These included massacres, forced disappearances, and widespread torture targeting suspected leftist sympathizers and the indigenous population. Reagan praised Rios Montt, which was the dictator of Guatemala, for his anti-communist stance. Now these are the same people that blame communism for state repression and protest crackdowns. The same story happened in El Salvador to the point where it almost seems like a cheap cash grab reboot. A civil war broke out where a right-wing military dictatorship was against left-wing socialist guerrillas. Reagan supported the dictatorship, human rights violations and massacres happened under his watch, American officials are found in the Salvadorian high command, $1 to $2 million of taxpayers' money is sent a day as aid. Dictatorship eventually wins and repression continues. Same story, different country. Is the US held accountable? Does Reagan go to prison? Of course the fuck not. We're talking about the empire here. They make and break rules for a living. Now Saddam Hussein's Iraq is something you would not expect the US to support given the quite recent history, but Reagan is a silly little bunny full of surprises. Hussein's brutal dictatorship and severe human rights violations were no secret to Reagan, but he decided to take Iraq off of the list of state sponsors of terrorism anyways and provided his regime with economic and military technological assistance. This was done to counterbalance Iran, who declared itself the enemy of the US in the 1970s. And while you might be saying, hey, why was the US so afraid of Iran if it's like half the world away? To that I say, when was the last time the US really cared about respecting sovereignty or borders? Despite Hussein's use of chemical weapons against Iran and even Kurdish civilians, the US maintained its support, prioritizing the containment of Iran over addressing these violations. Sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? Hey, do you remember Al-Qaeda? You know, the right-wing religious fundamentalist groups responsible for numerous terrorist attacks, including the big one on September 11th? Or the Taliban, currently ruling over Afghanistan. Well, did you know that these two groups were directly supported by the Reagan administration and the CIA? The Mujahideen, a jihadist Afghan coalition group, was fully supported by the US government under Reagan during the Afghan-Soviet War in what was called Operation Cyclone. One of the anti-Soviet warriors putting the army on the road to peace was Osama bin Laden. Yeah, that does not look good on your resume now, does it? Well, the Mujahideen were waging a guerrilla war against the Soviet-backed Afghan government at the time, and that is exactly why Reagan liked them so much, while eventually pushing the Soviets out and leaving the previously fairly stable socialist government up for grabs. The country fell into a civil war, but at that point, the US just stopped giving a fuck and dipped. The Mujahideen then devolved into separate faction organizations who fought over Afghanistan, most notably Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. While the US seemingly helped them during the 1980s to fight off the evil commies promising them autonomy, bin Laden quickly realized that they had only done so to secure their hegemony in the Middle East. Now frustrated with US imperialism in the region following the 1991 Gulf War, Al-Qaeda launched attacks against US bases and their allies as the 90s went on, and then of course the big one on September 11th. Did you know that Israel is not the first time that the United States supported an apartheid regime? Apart from having an apartheid system themselves in the form of Jim Crow laws up until the 1960s, the US directly supported South African apartheid even during the 1980s as the black struggle led by Nelson Mandela was taking place. Now South African apartheid deserves a whole video on its own, Just keep in mind that the white minority in South Africa, usually direct descendants of British colonialists, exploited black, cheap African labor while controlling the government and segregating the black population. Elon Musk actually comes from one of these families, by the way, just to remember what kind of a person he is. As the resistance to this was taking place in the 70s and 80s, Ronald Reagan's administration's approach was characterized by a policy known as constructive engagement, which according to him aimed at maintaining diplomatic and economic ties with South Africa while encouraging gradual reform. Basically the same stance as Joe Biden's position towards Israel. We encourage a two-state solution, but we will still support the government which engages in apartheid. Now Reagan, given the chance to actually punish the apartheid regime, opposed comprehensive economic sanctions against South Africa, arguing that they would harm both the black and white South Africans and reduce US influence. He vetoed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986, which called for mandatory sanctions. Congress, however, overrode Reagan's veto. This led to the enactment of the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, which imposed sanctions including bans on new investments, loans, and the import of certain South African goods. And as we can see, this sanction was such a blow to the pro-apartheid government that it was forced to abolish the system altogether and allow anti-apartheid and leftist parties to run for office, eventually leading to a Nelson Mandela presidency. This just goes to show that sanctions, for better or for worse, work as a weapon against certain regimes. Problem is that this weapon is only held by the United States alone and uses it for its own interests. Now let's rewind back a little bit and talk about Ronald Reagan's domestic policy and Reaganomics. Ronald Reagan's economic policy, which later became known as Reaganomics, were based on the ideas of neoliberalism, which is basically like if you ask a billionaire on how the world should be run, but he has to hold himself off from saying like the most immoral shit possible. So he just says, government deregulation and free market. Neoliberalism, attempting to salvage capitalism during the Cold War, basically boils down to stripping off all governmental regulations placed on corporations and the market from fucking over the working class, while simultaneously privatizing previously state-owned industry and funding the police to punish dissent. Now, if you're thinking, hey, that sounds really fucking awful and dystopian, don't worry, they knew about that, and that's why they hid all of that behind the rhetoric of liberty, freedom, and of course, battling communism. Setting the precedent for what's to come and Reagan's stance towards the working class came fairly early. In August 1981, approximately 13,000 air traffic controllers, represented by the PATCO labor union, went on strike after failing to reach an agreement with the federal government. Problem is, it is prohibited by law to strike if you're a federal employee. Ronald Reagan, who originally campaigned as a seemingly pro-labor president as he was the head of the Screen Actors Guild in the 60s, now took an extremely anti-labor position, giving the strikers a 48-hour window to return to work unless they want to be fired. While some strikers returned to work in fear of losing employment, hundreds ended up fired, which set a clear precedent signaling to the capitalist class that union and strike busting will be tolerated under his administration. Now, as mentioned, Reagan cut taxes, and while he cut taxes in general, he especially cut them for the top 20 and 1% earners. He did so through the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981, which lowered the highest income brackets from 70% to 50%, while the lowest income brackets from only 14% to 11%. Later he lowered taxes again in his second term through the Tax Reform Act of 1986, which lowered top earners' taxes from the previous 50% to a staggering 28%. This resulted in top earners making huge gains while bottom earners not keeping up with inflation. Today we can directly trace Reagan's economic disparity policy with the current situation in the United States, where today the top 10% of income earners own about 72% of total wealth in the country, while the bottom 50% only owns about 2% of the total wealth. What we now have is not only staggering wealth inequality between capitalists and workers, but a minimum wage that, while it has risen over the year, has not caught up with inflation. Things are just more expensive than the average wage earner can afford. And to add insult to injury, at the start of his presidency, Reagan made more than $22 billion in cuts to social welfare programs, including federal student loans and the Comprehensive Employment and Training Program, just a spit in the face of the working class people. Did you know that you can kind of blame the death of Freddie Mercury on Ronald Reagan? Well, not really. But also kind of yeah. See, Reagan was either extremely useless or actively reactionary when it came to the AIDS epidemic, which started in 1981, the same year that he took office. While knowing fully well about the lives being claimed by AIDS, he ignored the public health crisis for years, while defunding public research and privatizing Social Security. As a result, thousands of people were dying without a public cure. AIDS was nicknamed the gay disease, as it primarily affected gay men and then later sex workers. Reagan, being a conservative Christian man promoting family values, of course lacked any kind of sympathy towards the people affected. It took until 1985, when one of his close Hollywood friends, Rock Hudson, died of the disease, for Reagan to finally address the epidemic and take some kind of action. And yes, I know, Freddie Mercury died in Britain, which had completely different politics. It had a female clone of Ronald Reagan. But if his administration took action like a government is supposed to and funded public research, thousands of lives could have been saved. Maybe including Freddie Mercury. Now let's talk about Ronald Reagan and how he turned the term war on drugs into a racist crusade. Ronald Reagan used dog whistles such as war on drugs and welfare queen to rhetorically target people of color and gain the Southern vote. This is no conspiracy either. Here is Reagan's campaign advisor admitting to it in a leaked phone call.
You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968 you can't say nigger, that hurts your backfire, so you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites.
Exit polls from the time suggest that there was not a significant fear over drugs by the population, but Reagan decided to make it a national emergency anyway, when he turned Nixon's rhetorical term war on drugs and turned it into a literal war on the possession of drugs. Now, as we went over in Reaganomics, his policy directly created mass inequality while cutting social spending on education and welfare programs. This policy devastated poor working class neighborhoods, usually of people of color, who only very recently gained some kind of economic liberty after Jim Crow ended. This is why the war on drugs, which basically boils down to extremely harsh punishment for the possession of drugs like crack cocaine, was specifically targeting poor black neighborhoods, where drugs often became the only feeling of escape in a society which has left you behind. Reagan turned the problem of drug use, similarly with the problem of poverty, into an individual problem, where he claimed that it's the fault of the individual for systemic issues concerning inequality and mental health. His 5-gram 5-year law made the possession of crack 100 times more punishable by law than regular powdered cocaine. This was simply because crack cocaine was used more predominantly in poor, predominantly African American communities, while powder cocaine was more commonly used by wealthier, white individuals. But the most insidious part is the one that directly connects to the Iran-Contra affair, which we talked about before. See, Reagan had a very nice relationship with the private sector. I think that we talked about that enough. Specifically the private prison industrial complex, which essentially legalizes literal slavery if the person is incarcerated and the private prison uses their free labor for profit. Just read the 13th Amendment, which bans slavery unless you're incarcerated. It's right there. Not only did the private prison industrial complex highly benefit from the artificially created war on drugs by Reagan, but the Contras, remember them, produced cocaine and sold this cocaine back to the United States, all the while the CIA turned an intentional blind eye. This directly poured fuel to the fire of the crack epidemic, incarcerating hundreds of thousands of black people for the crime of the possession of the drug. This entire administration, apart from brutal destabilization of countless countries in the name of anti-communism, was a plan to impoverish poor, mainly black and Latino working class communities through neoliberal reform, which made the rich richer and the poor poorer, get them addicted to drugs as their only escape, fund the guys producing those drugs, make the drugs extremely illegal, fund the police to obscene militant levels, and imprison thousands of people of color for the crime of existing in the hellscape America which he has created, all the while making money off of it through private prison donations. This is the legacy that Ronald Reagan has left behind. A man who not only ruined hundreds of thousands of lives under his time as president, but also the cascade systemic shitstorm which he has created through his reforms that still haunt the United States to this very day.